a little bit of more about me. I'm Greg Aspeon on Itch or Discord. May have seen my bird avatar around. I've made a couple of freeware puzzle games, definitely more on the hobbyist side. But for longer than that, I've been for like last 10-15 years, I've been helping out with like puzzle hunt style events, making puzzles for those, mostly ones that were like local to the Seattle area. So I've got a sample of some like games on the left and puzzles on puzzles on the right. And so for this talk, I want to talk about like Metapuzzles as sort of a place where those two things can intersect. So what is a metapuzzle? The way the definition I tried to come up with is like a puzzle that brings together like information or resources across more than just a single puzzle. So I'm not talking about like what sometimes gets described as meta, where you have to like break the fourth wall and go to a like open the game files or like go to a website outside the game, like the like the previous talk, but sort of within the game, but more than just like one single puzzle. So here are some examples of some games that have done this in various ways. They've been are definitely some some classics that have done these, but I sort of feel like anecdotally in the last in the last couple of years, probably like starting around Tunic, seems like there's been sort of an upswell of them. And my sort of hope / suspicion is that there's that is that seeing more of these games, more of them come getting some relative for Thinky games broader appeal, shows that there's some mainstream and some more like demand for these that's now we're starting to satisfy. And so selfishly I'm interested in seeing like more people do stuff with them. So leaving games aside for a moment to talk about puzzle hunts for a bit. So what is a puzzle hunt? The slide is full of generalizations. Every creative field has exceptions, so they're usually in a lot of places, but generally speaking, you've got team-based competition where you get a puzzle, it doesn't have instructions, you figure it, you solve it, you find an answer, it gets you and then it gives you more puzzles. There's going to be uses, they say, a couple of distinctions from like ARGs, which also have no instructions, but they are less based on like steganography, less based on like going to other going to like other websites, or having sort of a like world existing like outside the game. It's more explicit line about what the puzzle is, and so every puzzle sort of has the implicit goal of getting to an answer that's either like a word or short phrase. And so often your starting point is to find find some sort of common thread between the things that you get. And one way that this often pans out is you get a bunch of things and you need to get turn each of those things into one letter, and then you put those letters together and that's your answer. So when you get to metapuzzles, those will combine the answers from multiple puzzles in some way to get to an answer, and those are usually more like culminating. Like often a hunt will end in a metapuzzle. Sometimes a hunt will contain multiple metapuzzles that lead to the next stage, or combine into like a meta puzzle or a super meta. So for what a meta puzzle looks like, here's sort of a simple example. Say you've got four puzzles with these four answers, and then you get to the actual like meta puzzle and there's nothing there. There are a couple of like terms for types of metas in the puzzle hunt community. This one's called sometimes called a pure meta, that the only data you get is the answers themselves. So the only like common thread here is that these are all single syllables. And the order that they're given, final and sir, you could put that together phonetically to get a final answer. So I guess the one sort of interesting thing beyond that is that like the answers sort of act as like what you'd call in like computer science like an abstraction layer. Like we don't need to know about all the details of the puzzles themselves. We just care about the answer that came out of them, which is nice because when it's a team event, because when I have like 5 or 10 or 50 other people on my team, like I don't need to bother the person who had figure out who on my team worked on each of these puzzles to find out like all the details about it. They can just write down the answer on a whiteboard or a Google Doc or a special like hunt tracking software, and that's all we need to know to put everything together. So in contrast to a pure meta is what's sometimes called a shell meta, where the puzzle comes with some extra information. So to sort of modify the previous example, if our puzzles aren't given to you in order, and instead like the meta puzzle itself has some data that gives you the order, you've got some sort of very vague clues that wouldn't be enough to give you an answer themselves, but you can when you have the answers, you can match them up, say, okay, well, like a letter, the only one of these that's a letter is phi, so that's phi is going to be number 1. Shell answers give you a lot more like allow you to do a lot more complicated mechanics, since shells can be pretty complex. They can be like complicated puzzles in their own right that the meta answers or other data is just a piece of. So, and sort of while I'm here, another thing that metas can allow for is sort of solving puzzles when you don't have all the data. So let's say that we've only solved 3 of these puzzles, and we figured out, okay, which of these, we have final and sir, and we can say, okay, we can say, okay, sir fits in one of these 2 blanks, and we might be able to guess, like, okay, this is going to be final answer, and we know even without even missing this one puzzle, maybe it's too hard, maybe it requires some piece of knowledge that like just no one on our team has figured out, but we can still like solve the meta puzzle and go on. So in a competitive standpoint, that allows to sort of create some balance around not making everything required. It also allows for what's called back solving, where now that we know what the answer is, we know that okay, this has to be Anne, and since we know there's a person, it's going to be either ANN or ANNE, and we can go back to this puzzle and put in both of those answers, and one of those will be right. And depending on how the rest of the puzzle hunt works, that might give us some advantage. That might give us some like extra points or other advantage in the rest of the hunt. A less common type is less common meta type, what's called a token meta, where you have where you don't use the answers directly, but whenever you solve a puzzle, you're given some a token or some piece of data, and that's what goes into the meta puzzle. This obviously allows even more flexibility, since you don't need you can just let your puzzle authors do anything you want. It also lets your tokens be anything you want. They can be symbols, they can be pictures, they can be they can be like items in a video game. They can do all kinds of stuff. So the actual like design process for these is a little interesting, since hunts are often like designed as a team. Some hunts have a like tradition of last of like previous team of like last team to win runs the next one. So order of operations usually sort of start with like the scope, say, okay, we're going to want to run, for this example, 4 puzzles, talk about like the theme, or is there going to be a story. There's often a tradition about meta puzzle enters being a thematic pun. I didn't use that for this, didn't come up with a good one that fit with these slides. Then you can actually test the meta without any real puzzles. You could just make up some answers and give those to people, and and see how that works. Then once that works and you're confident with it, then you can say, okay, I need you go to your puzzle writing path of your team. It's like, okay, I need 4 puzzles with these 4 answers, and let people sign up for answers and write puzzles with those answers. And they can come in sort of whenever they come in. Some hunts even have like backup puzzles where it's easy to change the answer to whatever you want if one of the other puzzles falls through. So what happens if we look at this, if we try to apply some of these ideas over to Thinky games? And I've sort of like, in an attempt to avoid spoiling anything, I've sort of kit bashed some examples from a few different games that you might recognize or you might not recognize. But so first one's going to be as sort of an example of what might be like an information meta is languages and ciphers. So you've got while like the simple cipher of you have 26 symbols representing 26 letters is kind of a cliche. Like maybe that's because it works. Like you've got the common, you've got sort of a common thread. You see these, set of symbols or something that work, in a bunch of places and recognize, okay, there is some sort of meaning to be conveyed here. Each piece of information gives you, each piece of information you collect gives you a little bit more to help decipher it, whether that's like just, another string, whether it's a string with some sort of, some sort of contextual information that might tell you what it is, or if it might just be like a straight up letter or something telling you directly about how it works. So it's a case where very much like, the earlier the difficulty will go down, the more you collect, like a lot of the like puzzle hunt metas do. So the question is like, what's the final answer though in this case? Like, you'd want to have some sort of message that's like only solvable if you have, if you have language knowledge. But then you also need to make it clear that like this is the last thing and not just like another message that you can draw from. So what's a shell meta look like? So one thing that I think of as like a shell of when the meta tells you something about what you're looking for is like where you enter your answer. So if you imagine you're doing an adventure game, you find this control panel with 12 buttons. If you either like recognize or find like a note saying that like these are the zodiac symbols, that'll shape some information about what you're looking for. You're looking for something with dates or something with constellations, and that'll tell you, that means that like you have that idea of what's in your head, and that where you're going to have to bring that information back. Another way that like, and this is sort of a less complete thought, is about sort of if shells are a way to organize information. They're also the games that kind of do like mind map or like conspiracy board type things that will sort of organize the information you collect for you. Where like you as you pick things up, they will add stuff to the grid and draw out connections. So I'm sort of two minds about this, that like sometimes the figuring out like what information is related and how to organize it is part of the challenge. But also I could see this as something that could make a game a lot more like accessible. And so it's definitely something that'd be worth sort of worth at least considering investing in, if it's something where you think it would make sense. But I feel like you could do an entire like own talk about like organizing information and like how you help people do it or how you don't help people do it. So over on the like, but if you're making a more systemic game, this is where my sort of like or resources part or the token meta analogy comes in. Something that like a lot of games, something that like a number of games do have the idea that like you've got your hub that's like that's a level select where that uses the same rules as rules as the rest of the puzzles, where you go into one of the puzzles and you solve it, and then it turns into a box that you can manipulate, or some object you can actually use in the world. And in this case, it's pretty simple that if these are like boxes that you can push into the pit and make a bridge, then you solve any two of these 4 puzzles and you can get out to the next place. But you can imagine that if there was a more complicated setup that used other mechanics, this could allow for some of that difficulty scaling too. Like maybe there's like 6 puzzles and there's like a pretty straightforward solution that uses 6 boxes, or if there's like a kind of a sneaky solution that uses 4, and then if you have those other 2 boxes, there's going to be you can use all 6 to like get a secret or unlock something new. So kind of lastly, I'm going to talk about a couple of like weirder things I've seen in Puzzlehunts that where I couldn't really draw analogies to in video games without like more directly spoiling stuff, so I didn't make slides for. Sometimes you have puzzles that break that abstraction layer, where you do need to go back into individual puzzles for more than just the answer. So like in the sort of systemic example, I would say compare that to like Portal, where you go into a level and you exit the level, and that's an elevator with a load screen that takes you to the next level. That's an entirely different like virtual space versus something like some other games where you have multiple levels that might have like walls and stuff between them, but it's still on one like virtual world, and as such you can maybe do stuff that has stuff from different puzzles interacting. Some hunts have had cases where you have like, instead of having here's one meta and here's 5 puzzles, here's one meta, here's 6 puzzles, here's like 30 puzzles and here's 5 metas, and you need to figure out which answers go with which ones based on usually finding common threads. Usually in this case there will be shell metas, so you can use the shells to identify things. And I guess the video game example equivalent to this would be something like a La Mulana, where you have like just so many clues and and aren't really sure how to organize them. And also there have been hunts that like mess with the whole a puzzle has an answer that's a word or phrase thing. Like you have puzzles with multiple answers, puzzles with answers that are do not just use letters that use like emojis or numbers or other things, or have like other sort of weird structures and interactions. And obviously in like any of those cases, because the meta is tied to the answers, it's the meta is going to be tied to however that weirdness is. And I don't know how this would apply to video games though, because we don't really have a convention to violate. But if you did have a game with a convention that established a convention about how like you were gathering information for metapuzzle type stuff, you could then maybe break that in an interesting way. So a couple of sort of pulling this together to and think about it in some questions for design is like like what are the answers in your game? Are there like information? Are there information resources that you're collecting? Is there an abstraction layer around puzzles that's letting players think about the think about things more on their own, or can you break it? Does the player even like know that there's a meta puzzle? Like what's is there something has a big some sort of sense of like, hey, this is a meta puzzle? Is there a common thread that's lurking? Is there something's organizing info? And like how do you want to handle partial solvability? Like a lot of do you want to require everything? Do you want to say like, hey, here's a 4-digit combination. If you find 3 of the digits and just brute force the last 10 things, that's okay. That's just something you want to think about and how you would want to handle that. Yes, that's what I had. This is based on some blog posts that I wrote earlier this year, and here's a link to that. Obviously, yeah, I can definitely have some time for questions. I will be a lot more free to talk spoilers for specific stuff on Discord. So you can definitely hang out there, but can probably have some time for questions now.
Awesome, thank you so much. Always love anything about Metapuzzles, and we've had a bunch of questions as well. So I can ask you some of those now. I actually want to start with one that's connected to what you just said about spoilers. So Jagriff was asking, how annoying is it that it's hard to talk about Metapuzzles without talking about them because they can be spoilery? Yeah, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard, and that's sort of why. Yeah, I originally had a I tried. That's why I tried to land in my not talking about specific games version of this presentation.
I think you did a good job as well, because I could identify from some of the examples that, oh yeah, that's from that game, but without you actually explicitly spoiling it. But you still had a bunch of games listed at the very start of the presentation, so people can go and play them, and then eventually they'll be able to match them up with some of the examples you gave. Next question from Plush Lawler here. What do you think of the fact that meta mechanics and puzzles are relegated late into games, or I guess typically relegated late into games? Should games be more upfront about meta stuff instead of the existence of it being spoilery?
Yeah, I think it'd be a lot easier to have to have conversations about them if they were if they were upfront.
Yeah.
But that's something that some of the larger hunts have done. That in the puzzle hunt world, some of the larger hunts have done is having an early game, having an early hunt milestone of being able to say okay, only a handful of teams are going to get to the end of this 120 puzzle thing. But at the end of the first 30 puzzles, there's a series of metas that leads to a nice point where you get to go around and do a thing. It's obviously not the ending of the plot, but does accomplish a goal and maybe get a little prize after that. And so maybe there is a way of having some sort of intermediate goal based on that. But I don't know how you make that satisfying while still being clear that there's more stuff down the line.
Yeah, I love that because sometimes I'll recommend a game to somebody, but I have to say I can't really tell you why I'm recommending it, but I'm recommending this game to you. You should play it or whatever. But if there were earlier examples in the game of the thing that I'm recommending it for, then maybe it'd be easier to recommend it, because I could say, well, in the first 10 minutes you'll encounter this thing. And when I was just thinking about that, it made me think of in A Monster's Expedition. This is not a meta puzzle related thing, but there's quite a good mechanical reveal within the first 20 minutes of the game, and I think that's a good example of it's setting you up to expect mechanical reveals like that later. And maybe there's a similar thing we could do with meta puzzling as well. I had another question here, which is actually I had one kind of slightly jokey question, which is, I know is a big debate, but is back solving cheating?
I think if it's cheating I think the only people it's cheating are the people that if you had someone on your team who really wanted to solve the puzzle, wanted to solve the puzzle in the intended way. So So when I'm back solving, I try to be careful and be hey, I think I've learned some stuff from the meta puzzle. you want that information if I see that someone's like actively working on a puzzle that I've learned something about.
That's really good. I was expecting it was a joke question, but you gave a really good answer. That's actually, if we could now apply that if we were doing a puzzle hunt with a group of people. We can now apply that advice. That's great. Thank you. So then the final thing, unless another question came through, I don't think so. The final thing I wanted to ask was, are there where would you recommend getting started with puzzle hunts in general, or maybe even Metapuzzles in video games? But I think Puzzlehunts is where people will be less familiar. What would your recommendations be?
I mean, I think like Puzzlepint is a pretty common one that's recommended to start. They've got a monthly event that has a couple of beginner friendly puzzles and a meta, and a meta puzzle. And they have live events in a lot of different in a lot of different cities. Not just in the US, so you can see if there's one near you. And even if there isn't, they have all their PDF. They have PDFs of all their puzzles, going back many years, so you can check those out.
Awesome.
And there are a lot of
Oh, well, sorry.
Continue. Yeah, there are also some purely online ones that I don't remember off the top of my head that people also recommend.
So actually, that's always been a question I've had, because I've done some of the puzzle pints and I love going to them. But I've never done one of the bigger ones like the MIT Mystery Hunts, all that kind of stuff. I've always been a little confused when looking at them. Do I have to be there in person, or do they usually try and make accommodations for people to join remotely?
Yeah, so most events will actually talk about that have a physical thing, will have that in their FAQ. Mystery Hunt, it's usually up to individual teams that there is traditionally the final step is to find a thing hidden somewhere on campus, so you need to have people on someone on your team on campus to find that thing. And then it's a matter of is your how much are the key does an individual team want to handle the logistical challenges of being sort of mixed local and remote.
Right. So do you sometimes see teams that just accept that they won't be able to do the final part of that mystery hunt, and it's just that's fine, well, we did all the other puzzles along the way, we don't have to do the the in-person?
I believe there are.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think that was everything. In which case, we're now going to go to a break, and the cat a different cat this time, has shown up just on cue. So I'll go feed them again. So thank you once again, Greg, for that. And if any other questions come up, please ask them in Discord. Please don't jump up there. No, don't do that. Okay. Sorry, no, I'm causing problems. If there's any other questions, please go and ask them on, oh gosh, what are you doing? On the Thinky Games Discord, thinkygames.com/Discord, and Greg will be there to answer as Aspeon. Thank you so much, Greg.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.